Major Neill Franklin is a former commander for the Education and Training Division at the Baltimore Police Department. He also worked for the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. Now, Neill retired from the police force in 2009 after, as Damon mentioned, 34 years of service. But he continues to work. And his work these days about raising awareness about what he considers the negative effects and the failure of the war on drugs, and also the negative impact of prohibition on communities. Neill works as the executive director of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition group, and you might be wondering why he does this. Well, he's sick to death of the number of lives that have been lost, both civilian and police officer, because of the war on drugs, and he's making it his business to do something about that. Neill Franklin.
Wow, this is great. It really is. Stop the Violence, BC. Evan, thank you for that leadership. There's a good thing happening here in British Columbia, and I wish it were occurring more across not just Canada, but the U.S. and around the world. So thank you for that leadership, Evan. And I want to thank you guys. I want to thank you for being here, because this is where it really begins, with you. No matter what we have to say, no matter how we go about leading people, without you, nothing gets done. And therefore, there will be no change. So who am I? And what gives me credibility to stand here before you today? Well, I'm the son of a teacher. I'm a longshoreman in the state of Maryland, in Baltimore. I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore has gone through some significant change over the past few decades, some serious change, as a matter of fact. And I spent my time on the streets in Baltimore in the 1960s and 70s in a community called Reservoir Hill. It was a thriving community. My mom still lives in that community. She's been in that house for 52 years. I think I'm probably telling my age here, but 52 years. When I was in that community in the 60s and 70s, we had a thriving business district. Just about every home in that community was occupied. It was a strong community. The schools were strong. And there was absolutely no open-air drug markets in our city. Not in our city, in our neighborhood. I knew not one kid in Reservoir Hill who dropped out of school. Now, I'm sure there were a couple here and there, but I didn't know any of them. My brother went into law enforcement before I did. He became a member of the Maryland State Police in the 1970s, and I followed him into the business. And we eventually ended up with a sister also following us in. And not too long after I got into the business, I went into undercover drug work. And I thought that this was a thing to do. I had been taught that people who used and sold drugs were bad people. And we thought that we were really doing good things for our community. Baltimore, bear with me for a second, this is really tough. This is really tough, but I'm going to get through it. Baltimore, which is still my hometown, in the 1970s, law enforcement was pretty much bribed, and Darren, I think you mentioned Richard Nixon, was pretty much bribed to start enforcing drug laws. Have any of you seen The Wire, the HBO series The Wire? Okay. The Wire is pretty much a documentary. David Simon and Ed Burns took 40 years of Baltimore history and compressed it into 5. People will tell you that it's fiction. But I stand here before you today and tell you that, yes, we've taken bits of time and moved them around. We changed the names of some of the players. But for the most part, it is an extremely accurate depiction of Baltimore. But it's not just about Baltimore. It's about every major city in Baltimore and outside of the United States. I mean, within the United States and outside of the United States. The neighborhoods that are depicted in this series are real neighborhoods. These weren't Hollywood sets. These were real communities, real neighborhoods. So what you see on that screen, the vacant homes, the boarded up homes, the kids on the corners selling drugs, those were actual open-air drug market corners. Many of the characters depicted in the series have even been given roles in the series. One in particular is a gentleman by the name of Little Melvin Williams, who was the most notorious heroin dealer in Baltimore. I grew up in the same neighborhood that he lived and worked in. His wife, who eventually became his wife, went to the senior prom with my brother. For those of you who have seen this series, Little Melvin Williams plays the role of the preacher who visits the boxing ring from time to time. These are real characters. Baltimore went through a metamorphosis from a thriving city, thriving communities, healthy neighborhoods, to sheer devastation and disaster. And why did this occur? It occurred because of drug prohibition. Not because people used drugs. People were using drugs in Baltimore for a long time before the 1970s and the 1980s. But when we broke up those organizations as depicted in The Wire, who had agreements among themselves to conduct their business a certain way, when we broke those organizations up, we made way because they weren't going, the void wasn't going to remain there. It's a lucrative business. So we made way for hundreds of young entrepreneurs to enter the business, and the only way that they knew how to manage that market share was with violence. And guns soon became tools of the trade so that they could control their corners, protect their market share. I just had to touch on that real quick just to show you what Baltimore and many other cities in the U.S. went through during this period of time of enhanced drug enforcement in our communities. And every time I go back to visit my mother in her neighborhood, you know, I just have to cruise around the blocks and the streets just to see and be reminded what has happened in that community. And it's quite depressing. Criminal gangs go to war over market share. You guys are experiencing something very similar here with the marijuana trade. Marijuana, which is virtually worthless, it's a plant that anyone can grow just about anywhere. But because of the illicit trade, up until recently, by weight, it had more value than gold. Darren talked a little bit about the government propaganda for saving our children. Well, let's see. Just like depicted in The Wire, and just like the marijuana trades that you guys are dealing with today, Kids are not just attracted to that lifestyle. You got to understand this. They're not just attracted to the bling bling and, the money that they think they can make. In our neighborhoods back in Baltimore, they see the guys with the fancy cars and they have the nice looking women with them. And, this is all they know because that's all they see in these communities. And they're not just attracted to that. You see, these gangs have better recruitment programs than Fortune 500 companies. They know how kids think. They know what they're attracted to. They know how to get into their heads. And they recruit kid after kid after kid after kid into this business. And you know what? That's not much different than alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. You see, when these kids are recruited into this business, it's not very long before they drop out of school. In Baltimore, the dropout rate at one time reached about 60%. It's now probably between 45 and 50. But it's not going to get much lower, not as long as we have the illicit drug trade. I also understand that here in BC, you have a serious dropout rate problem too, but mostly for Aboriginal young boys. When kids drop out of school, in the U.S., it's probably somewhere a little over 90% chance of entering into the criminal justice system. And once they enter into the criminal justice system, they are pretty much lost. Don't get me wrong, one or two eventually get turned around with the help of a mentor and some guidance along the way, but for the most part, they're lost. And nothing, virtually nothing good comes out of our criminal justice system. It's not a correctional facility they enter, it is a housing facility that they enter. Where the gangs originate in the United States, they started in prison. And when you go into prison, in order to survive, you got to do one or two things. Either you got to be one of the best fighters that there is, and even they don't make it sometimes, but you got to fight, or you have to become a member of a gang for protection. So if you go in nonviolent, there's a very good possibility you're going to come out with some violent tendencies. I've been told that 20% of the male prisoners here in British Columbia are from the Aboriginal population. But the thing is, they're only about 3% of the overall population. And we face very similar challenges in the U.S. with black male incarceration. In 2008 in the United States, we imprisoned white males at a rate of 943 per 100,000. I mean, that in and of itself shows that we have an addiction to incarceration in the United States. We are 5% of the world's population, yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. We're even locking up white males at a rate higher than what we arrested black males for, not we, but South America during the height of apartheid. That was only a little over 800 per 100,000. But what are we arresting black males? At what rate in the United States? Well, that's 4,919 per 100,000. See, it's all about how police operate, our strategies and practices and policies, and where we enforce certain laws. And I don't have time for it today, but there is concrete proof that that was part of Richard Nixon's plan. All you have to do is to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and you'll see what that was all about. So maybe we need to ask the question, What children are we protecting? All right, so enough of the good news. Now for the bad. You see, those in prison, believe it or not, are some of the lucky ones. We have more kids being murdered during this drug prohibition era than any time before. So the lucky ones are in prison. And on that note, I'm going to briefly cover some violence. You see, it is violence that got me here. During my career in law enforcement, I went from working undercover to managing numerous multi-jurisdictional drug task forces in the state of Maryland and the eastern half of the state, and I was probably one of the worst prohibitionists in the state of Maryland. In the state of Maryland. I really thought that we were doing a good thing, and I was a dangerous individual back then if you were using or selling drugs, mostly using. So, how did I make this shift? Prior to what I'm about to explain to you, there were some things that took place in my life, but nothing more significant than this single act of violence. This picture here is 3 months after I retired from the Maryland State Police as a major. And what the other gentleman is holding up in that photo is called a shadow box. It has all of my insignia from the time that I was in the Maryland State Police. You know, all the different ranks that I made, all my different promotions and special units that I was a member of, the SWAT team, and dynamic entries and raids. That's another story, how violent they are and the damage they do. But that's my whole career, and we receive a lot of gifts and a lot of awards on this particular night where you have your retirement celebration. But this is the last one that's presented to you. This is that special one that you wait to get, that you hang on your wall after you retire. And so it's got to be someone special that presents it to you. This young man, Ed Totley, was very special to me. Not only was he a dear friend for about 15 years, he worked for me on many undercover cases. See, he was one of the best, most accomplished undercover agents that the state of Maryland had ever seen. And just a few months after this event, we were having a conversation about a case that he was working in Washington, D.C. He was assigned to an FBI drug task force. And he was telling me about the drugs he was buying from this particular dealer, and that he's going to make this final buy. He'd been working this guy for many months, and this was going to be the night. He's going to take this guy down. Remember, we thought we were doing great work, but he's going to take this guy down and, wrap it up, and then he'll move on to the next case. Well, 11 years ago, on October 30th, the night that was supposed to be that final buy from this guy, that's the night that this guy decides that, well, I'm going to keep the drugs and the money. And he felt that in order to do that he had to end Ed's life. So, when this guy returned back to the car that Ed was driving, he paused for a moment as he was smoking a cigarette, takes his time, just as cool, puts out the cigarette, reaches over and shoots Ed at point-blank range. I live 53 miles from that hospital, and it was the longest ride of my life, even though I was in triple figures, over 100 miles per hour pretty much the entire way. And when I got to the hospital, the first thing, see, I knew about this case, and the first thing that I was thinking, I knew there was surveillance, I knew the car was wired with cameras and sound, and the first thing that came to my mind as a commander, one who had managed cases like this before, and was who screwed up. It was who missed their assignment. It was who dropped the ball and left his kids without a father. But then, as the days go by and the weeks go by, you begin to realize something, because I started to think about the other police officers I knew that were murdered working drug cases. When I was working undercover, there was Marcellus Ward in Baltimore City, similar circumstances. And then, and at this time, I was a lieutenant colonel with the Baltimore Police Department, and 2 years after Ed was assassinated, we had a family in Baltimore that was killed. You see, it's not just about cops dying. In just about any city in the U.S., we have innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. And it's not always just a crossfire. Some of it's intentional. No city, no community is safe. 2 years after Ed, we had an entire family of 7 murdered at the hands of one drug dealer in one night. This is the Dawson family in East Baltimore. And that was their home on the corner. And on that corner was a drug dealer. A drug dealer who valued that corner so much and the money that he was making, he decided to take the lives of this family, all because the mother was trying to protect those boys you see depicted right there. She didn't want them in that environment. She didn't want them recruited. And she didn't want them facing the dangers of drive-by shootings. So she was working with the police to get that drug dealer out of the neighborhood. He didn't like it, and one morning, on October 3rd, he broke into their home on the side door and set their home on fire. And every one of them died in that fire. You see, and this isn't just about Baltimore. This isn't just about Baltimore. We have innocent people being murdered all across the United States, Mexico, Venezuela, and even here in B.C. So, I show you this because in the 1920s, the end of alcohol prohibition was largely in part to the efforts of women, mothers, who decided and realized in order to protect their children, they had to end the policy of prohibition. So it wasn't about alcohol, it was about the policy. It was about the policy. It's the policy that is dangerous. It is the policy that makes our neighborhoods and communities dangerous. It is the policy that paves the way for criminal enterprise and criminal gangs to make billions upon billions of dollars every year around this globe. We have to change and then the policy. I mean, I didn't intend to bring you to such a solemn place, but there are a lot of people who don't realize just how dangerous this place we are in with prohibition. They just don't realize how dangerous it is. There are many people who live sheltered lives. And this kind of snuck up on us over the past 3 or 4 decades, and now the numbers are in. But there is hope. There is hope. The fact that you are here tonight, that's hope. I thank you for taking an active role. Evan left you with a wonderful guide of how to get involved, what you can do. And I hope, I pray, that you grab on to that and join forces with folks like Evan and the many others who are responsible for trying to end the violence here in BC. Just grab on to that and help them solve some issues here in BC as well as around the world. I thank you for your time. I really do. Thanks.